I had exactly one breath to decide whether the dying child in front of me was worth the secret I had kept my whole life. My fingers curled around the small glass jar, the salt inside shifting with a soft, papery hiss that sounded impossibly loud in the silence of the corridor. I pressed it flat against my palm, hiding it in the fold of my apron, the way my grandmother had taught me to hide the truth quietly, carefully, like a coal you carry so long it turns to diamond. I stepped out from the shadow of the service hallway, the bleached tiles of the Park Estate's west wing suddenly feeling less like a floor and more like the surface of a frozen lake. At the end of the corridor, Kang Dae-hyun stood at the door of his daughter's room, his tattooed hands gripping the bedrail with the controlled desperation of a man who had broken every enemy he had ever faced and could not break this one. The monitors behind him screamed in red. And the little girl in the bed, the one they said no doctor could save, was the color of ash and going grayer by the second. I knew what was in that room. I had smelled it the moment I crossed the estate's threshold, old swamp water and copper, the rot scent of a curse eating something alive. I had been pretending not to know for 3 days, keeping my head down, scrubbing floors, being exactly what my employment papers said I was. But my grandmother didn't send me 14,000 miles to scrub floors. Don't miss the jaw-dropping part. Like and subscribe now and watch how everything changes in the next twist. The rain in Seoul was nothing like Louisiana rain. Back home, rain was warm and slow and smelled like river mud and jasmine, like the earth was breathing out. This rain was a fist. It hit the windows of the Park Estate in hard, flat sheets, and the sound of it against the glass was less like weather and more like a warning, like something outside wanted in and wasn't going to stop asking. I stood in the grand foyer with my small suitcase pressed against my leg, and I let myself feel small for exactly 10 seconds. That was the rule my grandmother gave me whenever I walked into a room that was trying to swallow me whole. Feel it, count it out, then put it away. The foyer was the size of my entire neighborhood block back in Baton Rouge. Black marble floors so polished I could see my own face looking up at me, frightened and foreign. A chandelier overhead that dripped crystal like frozen rain. Everything in this house was designed to remind you how little you were. My name is Imani. 3 days ago I was a girl from the bayou who made her living knowing things about roots, about spirits, about the particular way the air thickens when something unseen has been eating at a place for a long time. I had never owned a passport before this. I had never been on a plane. I had packed my suitcase in 40 minutes flat, mostly jars. I wasn't here for the money though. The number they offered made my hands shake when I read it. I was here because of a deathbed vision and a woman who had never once been wrong about anything in 83 years of living. My grandmother had taken my hand 2 weeks before she passed, her grip still iron strong, and she'd said the golden dragon is dying from the inside out. Only the salt of the earth can save it. I thought she meant a man. I would learn too late and too slowly that she meant a 5-year-old girl named Hannah who was running out of breath in the west wing. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the foyer opened, and I put the small feeling away. He filled the doorway, the way storms fill a sky completely, suddenly, leaving no room for anything else. Tall, a suit so dark and so perfectly cut it looked like it had been sewn directly onto him. Tattoos climbing the side of his neck, disappearing beneath a collar that was buttoned to the throat. And his eyes, sharp, still, and absolutely without warmth, moved across me the way you'd scan a room for exits. Not a greeting, an assessment. I lifted my chin and looked right back. He looked at me the way you look at furniture. You don't remember ordering, mildly puzzled, faintly annoyed, already thinking about something else. You are the one the agency sent. It wasn't a question. His English was perfect. Each word placed with the cold precision of a man who had learned the language as a tool and had no interest in its warmth. His voice was low, and even the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to be obeyed. Yes, sir. I kept my spine straight and my hands loose at my sides. I'm Imani. I'm here to help. The sound he made was short and sharp, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff, but something that managed to be both dismissive and final at once. It was the sound of a door closing. I do not need help. He clasped his hands in front of him, and I noticed the rings on his fingers, heavy gold, the kind that left marks. I need a miracle. My daughter is dying, and every specialist in this country has stood in that room, looked at their charts and told me nothing I did not already know. You are here to clean the floors and stay out of the way. His eyes held mine with the flat steadiness of someone who had never once had to repeat himself. Do you understand? Most people, I learned later, couldn't hold that gaze for more than a few seconds. It wasn't anger. In it, anger was too human, too hot. It was something more like absolute certainty. The certainty of a man who had decided long ago how the world worked and had spent years making the world agree. I held it anyway. I understand my duties, Mr. Kang. I paused just long enough. But I also know that sometimes doctors spend so long looking for science that they miss what the problem actually is. The stillness that followed was different from the stillness before it. Heavier. The rain outside filled the silence like it was trying to help me make my case. Something moved behind his eyes. Not softening, nothing so generous as that. More like the flicker you see when a flame meets wind. A decision being made. Then it closed off. Do not speak to me of something else. His voice dropped lower, which somehow made it worse. You are a maid. You clean. You stay quiet. You do not wander. He held the last word in the air between us for a moment. Mrs. Kim will show you to your quarters. The kitchen is yours. The rest of this house is not. He turned, already done with me. Stay away from the west wing. He walked back through the oak doors without waiting for my answer. I stood in the marble foyer with the rain hammering the glass and the smell of that house pressing in on me, old money, antiseptic, and beneath it all, faint and cold as a warning, the rot I had already known was there. I didn't agree out loud. But I didn't agree at all. The West Wing didn't make noise. That was the thing about it. Every other part of the estate has the sounds a large house makes at night, the tick of pipes cooling, the muffled footsteps of staff finishing their work, the distant murmur of a television somewhere above me. But from the West Wing came nothing. A silence so complete and so deliberate, it felt less like quiet and more like something holding its breath. I felt it pulling at me all through dinner, all through Mrs. Kim's brisk, efficient tour of the kitchen and the narrow staff corridor and the small room that was to be mine. A cold, directional pressure, like standing near a drain. When Mrs. Kim left and the door clicked shut, I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself feel it fully. Then I opened my suitcase. I hadn't packed much in the way of clothes, enough to be presentable, enough to be unremarkable. But nested between a folded blouse and a spare pair of shoes were my jars. 7 of them, small enough to hide in a coat pocket, each one sealed with a square of cloth and a rubber band. Dried lavender, crushed brick dust red as old blood, iron filings, a small bundle of dried bayou sage, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of my grandmother's headscarf, a jar of soil from her garden, the garden she had tended for 40 years, the ground that had absorbed 40 years of her prayers. I set them on the nightstand one by one and looked at them for a long moment. If Tian found these, the kindest thing he would think was that I was unstable. I knew that. I put the thought down the same way. I put away the smallness in the foyer, counted it, acknowledged it, set it aside. Because through the wall I could hear it. Not with my ears. My ears heard nothing. But somewhere behind my sternum, in the place my grandmother always called the knowing place, I could feel a faint, rhythmic pull. Steady as a metronome, patient as wrought. It wasn't a heartbeat. Heartbeats were warm, irregular, alive with effort. This was mechanical, deliberate. The sound a thing makes when it is feeding and has been feeding for a long time. I closed my eyes. I reached out the way she taught me, not grasping, just opening, like a hand held palm up in the dark. And I saw her. A small girl at the center of a circle of gray mist, her edges blurring the way a candle blurs in wind. Not sick, not failing. Being emptied. Breath by breath, life by quiet life, something was drawing her out of herself like water through a cloth. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone in this house. I opened my eyes and the cold of the West Wing pressed against the wall behind me like a hand. I couldn't clean floors. I had known that since Louisiana, but I had to wait. I had to let the house sleep first. By 3 in the morning, the estate had gone completely still, not the natural stillness of a sleeping house. This was thicker than that, heavier, like the air itself had been pressed flat. I lay in my narrow bed and counted the minutes until I was certain. Then I sat up, tucked my jars into my apron pockets, and slipped out of my room in bare feet. The marble was cold enough to ache. I moved along the staff corridor and then into the main hallway, keeping close to the wall, letting the cold guide me the way. A current guides you underwater. I didn't need to think about which direction. The pull from the West Wing had become a certainty, a straight line drawn from the center of my chest to wherever Hana was. I found the guards before I found the door. 2 of them, large men in black suits, seated on either side of the entrance to the West Wing, both asleep. Not the loose, lolling sleep of exhaustion. Their bodies were too upright for that. Their heads dropped at angles that looked less like rest and more like something had simply switched them off. One still had his hand resting on his earpiece. I stood there for a moment and understood. The curse wasn't contained to one room. It had spread through the whole house like damp through old wood, slow and invisible, softening everything around the thing it was really after. These men hadn't chosen to sleep. They had been made to. I stepped between them and pressed the door open with the flat of my palm. The room was enormous and wrong in the way that expensive rooms can be wrong. Everything in it cost more than sense, and none of it was helping. Towers of medical equipment lined the walls, their screens casting a pale blue light over shelves of untouched toys. Stuffed animals with their button eyes catching the glow. A mobile above the bed, perfectly still. The air smelled like antiseptic, trying to cover something it couldn't name. And beneath that, faint but unmistakable, the scent I had first caught in the foyer. Swamp water, copper, rot. In the center of the bed, Hana was so small she barely disturbed the shape of the blanket. Her skin was the gray white of ash that has cooled completely. Her cheekbones pressed too close to the surface. She breathed in shallow, irregular pulls, each one sounding like it cost her something she didn't have left to spend. I did not go to her. Not yet. I went to the corners. Starting at the far left, I pulled back the edge of the rug with 2 fingers, and there it was exactly where I knew it would be. A small bundle, no bigger than my fist. Black hair coiled tight and bound with red silk thread, the whole thing dark and stiff with dried blood. A life-taker charm. Old work, intentional work. Someone who knew this child's name, who had walked freely through this room, had knelt in this corner and wished her dead. The anger came up fast and clean, the way it always did when I found craft used against someone who couldn't defend themselves. Child! They had done this to a child. I reached into my pocket and closed my fingers around the jar of salt. What are you doing? It wasn't a question. It was a wall. I spun around, the jar of salt still in my grip, and found him filling the doorway. Dae-hyun, fully dressed at 3 in the morning, a silver handgun leveled at the center of my chest with the steady, practiced ease of a man who had done this before and had never once missed. His face was fury stripped down to its bones. No coldness now, no careful stillness. Just rage, white, hot, and absolute. I told you to stay away from here. I didn't drop the jar. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my back teeth, but I planted my feet and kept my hands visible and looked at him straight. She's being poisoned, Mr. Kang. I kept my voice low, and even the way you speak around something that startles easily. Not by any virus, not by anything in her blood. I held the bundle up between 2 fingers, the black hair and red silk catching the blue light of the monitors. By this. He looked at it. A fast, involuntary look, the kind your eyes make before your mind can decide not to bother. Then he looked back at me, and something shifted in the fury. Not softening but fracturing slightly, the way ice fractures before it decides whether to hold. You are insane. His voice had dropped to a whisper which was worse than the roar. His finger adjusted against the trigger. You're some kind of witch. Did the Dragon Syndicate send you here? Did they tell you to finish her with your... He looked at the bundle again, his jaw tight. Your voodoo? I took 1 step toward him. He didn't fire. I had counted on the half-second of surprise and I spent it. Look at her monitors, Mr. Kang. Not at me. At her monitors. He didn't want to. I watched him resist it, watched the pride and the suspicion hold him in place for one breath. The machine screamed. Not the steady, rhythmic beeping of before. A full alarm, sudden and brutal, slicing through the quiet of the room like something tearing. I turned. Hana's chest was heaving in fast, desperate contractions, her small body working with everything it had left and pulling in nothing. Her lips were losing their color, gray bleeding to blue at the edges. Hana! The gun hit the floor before he finished her name. He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed the bed rail with both hands, leaning over her, his voice cracking open, in a way I don't think it had cracked in years. Hana! Hana, look at me. I'm here. Look at me. She couldn't hear him. Whatever had its hands around her was pulling hard now, faster, as if it knew someone had found the charm and was running out of time. I was already moving. The most powerful man in Seoul stood at that bedside with tears cutting down his face and nothing in his hands. And in that moment, he was just a father, desperate, helpless, and completely out of weapons. Move. I didn't wait to see if he would. I put my hand flat against his chest and pushed, and whether it was the shock of being touched or the shock of being commanded, he stepped back just enough. I snatched the charm off the floor with 2 fingers, crossed the room in 4 steps, and flung it into the hallway with the hard, deliberate motion of someone throwing something venomous away from a wound. It hit the marble and skidded into the dark. Distance wasn't a cure, but it was a loosening enough to work with, enough to buy the next 60 seconds. I was already unscrewing the jar. Salt and iron filings, mixed the way my grandmother mixed them, in the ratio she had pressed into my memory so many times. It lived in my hands more than my head. I moved around the bed in a slow, deliberate circuit, letting the mixture fall in a thin, unbroken line, and I did not let myself think about the gun on the floor, or the man behind me, or the way the alarm was still cutting through the air. I thought only about the circle, unbroken, intentional, sealed. And I let the words come up from wherever they lived inside me. Earth to earth and dust to dust, break the iron, break the rust, let the life return to stay, drive the shadows far away. My grandmother's voice was in it. It always was. Low and rhythmic, the words worn smooth from generations of use, the way river stones go smooth, not weakened by it but finished. I'd have said them once, twice, 3 times, and on the 3rd pass I felt the room change pressure. The way a room changes when a window is finally opened after too long. Behind me, Dae-hyun made no sound. The gray mist, the one I had only seen with my eyes closed before, began to move. I could see it now at the edges of the room, coiling and thinning, pulling apart like smoke when the fire beneath it dies. It had no will of its own. It was borrowed hunger, and whatever had lent it the hunger was severed now, the line cut, the charm gone, and the circle closed. Hana coughed. Once, hard, like something dislodged. Then again, softer. Then her chest settled into a rhythm that was slow and labored, but her own, genuinely her own, air moving in and out of a body that was choosing to keep going. The monitors dropped from red to yellow, then steadily to green. Her color changed so gradually. I might have imagined it, except I didn't. Gray to white to the faintest suggestion of pink spreading across her cheeks like the first light that comes before sunrise, tentative and then certain. She took one deep, rattling breath that seemed to come from the bottom of her, and then she slept. Really slept, her small hands uncurling, her brow smoothing out, her body releasing a tension it had been holding for God knows how many months. The silence that followed was enormous. I straightened up slowly, my hands trembling now that the work was done, and turned around. Dae-hyun stood at the foot of the bed with one hand still outstretched toward his daughter, frozen mid-reach. He looked at the monitors. He looked at Hana's face. He looked at the thin white line of salt on the floor. And then he looked at me. And for the first time since I had walked through his doors, I did not see the Mafia boss, or the cold voice, or the gun. I saw a man standing at the exact edge of everything he thought he knew, looking over. What did you do? The fury was gone. What replaced it was quieter, and somehow worse, the voice of a man standing in territory his mind had no map for. He was looking at me the way people look at something that has just rearranged the rules without asking permission. I pressed the back of my hand against my forehead and felt the sweat there, the particular exhaustion that comes after working, not physical work, but the other kind. The kind that draws from somewhere deeper than muscle. I broke the connection, Mr. Kang. I kept my voice steady, matter of fact. the way my grandmother always had when she explained the inexplicable. Make it plain. Don't dress it up. Don't apologize for it. Someone planted that charm in this room deliberately, to drain her. I didn't heal her. I just stopped the person who was killing her. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked past me into the hallway. I watched him crouch down beside the charm, still on the marble where I'd thrown it. He didn't touch it with his hands. He folded a pocket square into a square of cloth and used that, lifting it carefully, turning it in the blue-gray light of the corridor. He studied it, the way a man studies evidence methodically, without flinching, cataloging what he saw. Then something happened to his face. The grief drained out of it. The terror, too. What moved in underneath was something so cold and so absolute that the air in the hallway seemed to drop in temperature around him. His eyes went still and dark and flat, the way deep water goes flat before a storm hits the surface. This hair, he said, so quietly I had to hold my breath to hear it, belongs to someone in this house. It wasn't a question. He knew. I could see him knowing, watching the knowledge settle into him like a stone dropping through water, slow and inevitable and final. He stood. He was still holding the gun he'd dropped and retrieved, but he looked at it once and slid it back into the holster beneath his jacket with the careful motion of a man choosing his moment. He turned to me. You are not a maid. His eyes moved across my face. No maid knows how to do. He paused, and for the first time I saw him search for a word and not find one, whatever that was. I brushed the last of the salt dust from my palms. I told you, sir, I'm from the bayou. We know things you don't find in any book. He stepped closer. He was still overwhelming at close range, all that controlled power and barely banked rage, but I held my ground the way I'd held it in the foyer. You saved her! His voice shifted, stripped of everything except the question beneath it. Why? I looked at him straight. Because she's a child. I let that sit for one breath, and because I was told that you were worth saving too. He didn't speak to me again that night. He didn't need to. Within minutes of our exchange in the hallway, the estate came alive in a way that had nothing to do with mourning. Men in dark clothing moved through every corridor with the quiet, efficient urgency of people who had been trained for exactly this, not for curses but for betrayal, which amounted to the same thing in Dae-hyun's world. I pressed myself into a doorway near the kitchen wing and watched them work. 3 members of the kitchen staff were walked out before 2 in the morning, their faces carefully blank in the way faces go blank when showing fear is more dangerous than hiding it. One of the sleeping guards followed, still looking confused, which told me he genuinely hadn't known what he'd been used for. Small mercy. Through it all, Dae-hyun moved like a cold front wherever he went. The temperature of the room dropped. He issued instructions in low, clipped Korean that I didn't need to understand to read. His face had settled into something ancient and implacable. Not rage anymore. Rage burns itself out. This was the thing that comes after rage, when a person has made a decision they intend to keep. I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed too, wrung out to sleep, and kept watch on the West Wing's silence until it softened into something that felt, for the first time since I'd arrived, like ordinary, quiet. Around 6, Mrs. Kim appeared at my door. Mr. Kang will see you in the library. The library smelled like expensive tobacco and the particular heaviness of books that have been kept in the same room for decades. Dae-hyun was behind the desk, the charm sitting in front of him on a square of white cloth, like an exhibit at trial. He looked like a man who had not slept and had not wanted to sleep. Would have meant stopping, and stopping would have meant feeling it all. But his eyes, when they found mine, were the sharpest I had yet seen them. The hair belongs to my sister-in-law. He said it. The way you say something, you have already fully digested, every drop of surprise already processed and discarded. She wanted the inheritance. She believed that killing Hannah would break me completely. He looked down at his hands, spread flat on the desk, the rings, the stillness, the weight of them. I have killed men, Amani. I have done things that would make most people's souls shrivel away to nothing, and I could not protect my own daughter from a piece of string and some hair. He looked up. I don't believe in magic, he said. I believe in facts. And the fact sitting in front of me is that Hannah is breathing because of what you did in that room. His eyes didn't waver. So I want to know everything. All of it. A pause, precise as a blade. What are you? And who sent you here? I sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. It wasn't disrespect. It was clarity. The same clarity that had carried me into the West Wing at 3 a.m, that had kept my feet planted when there was a gun at my chest. Some moments call for formality. This one called for truth, and truth sits down. I'm a healer, I said. Back home, my people have been doing this work for centuries. Long before it had a name anyone outside would recognize. We use what the earth provides, its energy, its memory, to repair what hate has broken. I kept my eyes on his. That's what I am. That's what I was sent here to do. He leaned back in his chair and I watched him search my face with the methodical patience of a man who had built an empire partly on his ability to detect lies. He looked for a long time. And you think you can fix this? It wasn't quite skepticism. It was something more careful than that. My world is full of hate, Amani. Hate is not an interruption in my world. It is the business model. Your business is your own choice, I said. I'm not here to fix your world, but Hana is innocent, and what was done to her wasn't only about Hana. I leaned forward slightly. The curse was designed to kill her, yes, but it was also designed to make you look weak, distracted, vulnerable. Someone wanted you off balance so that something else could move in while you were grieving. The stillness lasted exactly 1 second. Then his fist came down on the desk with a force that rattled the charm on its square of white cloth. They are already moving. His voice was controlled fury, every word bitten clean. The Black Dragon Syndicate has been hitting my ports, my warehouses. 3 incidents in 2 weeks. They know I have been. He stopped, the word costing him something. Distracted. They think I'm a wounded animal waiting to be He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to me, looking out over Seoul in the early gray light. The city spread below him like something he owned, because largely he did. Stay, he said, not as a maid, as Hana's guardian. I will pay you whatever number you want. Name it. I don't want your money. He turned his head slightly. I want your word, I said. If I stay, you listen to me. When I tell you a room needs clearing, you let me clear it. When I tell you a person carries darkness, you keep them away from your daughter. No arguments, no exceptions. He turned fully from the window then, and for the first time, at the corner of that hard, unreadable mouth, I saw the ghost of something that was almost a smile. A maid, he said slowly, giving orders to the head of the Mafia. Is that a yes? It's interesting, he said. Which, in my world, is close enough. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had prepared for, and I had prepared for quite a lot. I moved into the room beside Hana's, close enough to hear her breathing through the wall, and I made it mine. The way I made any space mine: salt line at the threshold, a sprig of dried rosemary above the door, a grandmother's soil on the windowsill where the morning light could touch it, small anchors, enough to make the room feel like it was on my side. Hana improved the way spring comes gradually, then suddenly, then all at once. First she was eating a few bites, then full meals. Then she was sitting up in bed pointing at my tablet and demanding to know why the cartoon alligator didn't look anything like a real alligator, and I knew she was going to be fine. I told her about the real ones back home, the ones that moved through the bayou like old brown logs with eyes, and she listened with her whole body, leaning forward, her thin hands wrapped around her knees. Dae-hyun watched from doorways. That was his position in those early weeks, the threshold, never quite entering, never quite leaving. He would appear with gifts for her, extraordinary things, a necklace with a diamond pendant, a music box inlaid with gold, things that belonged in a vault or a museum. Hana would look at them politely and then turn back to me and ask what sound an alligator makes when it's angry. He didn't know what to do with that. He had been a boss for so long that fatherhood felt like a negotiation he hadn't studied for. But I noticed the changes. Small ones at first, his collar button undone by midweek, his tie loosened by the end of it. He started appearing in rooms before he was needed, which meant he was moving through his own house differently. Less like a man executing a route, and more like a man who was simply present somewhere. He started asking me things. About Louisiana, about the bayou, about what my grandmother's house smelled like and whether it was true that the summers there were hot enough to bend the air. One evening I was in the garden at dusk, working rosemary and mint through my fingers, moving along the perimeter of the property to clear the energy the way you clear dust methodically, without drama. I heard him behind me before he spoke. My men think you're a spy, he said, the ones who aren't afraid of you anyway. I kept working. What are the afraid ones saying? that you talk to plants. I laughed, and it surprised me, full and genuine, rising up before I could shape it into anything more careful. Good, I said. Fear keeps them honest. He stepped closer. I could feel the warmth of him at my back, which was its own strange thing that a man so associated with coldness could radiate that much heat. I am not afraid of you, Imani. A pause. But I am curious. You came 14,000 miles for a child you had never met and a man you didn't know. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual authority, which somehow made it more serious. Why? I turned then. The sunset was doing something generous to his face, softening the sharp angles, warming the dark eyes, making him look less like the thing people whispered about in the city below and more like something much simpler and much harder to dismiss. A man. Just a man standing in a garden asking a real question. I looked at him for a moment before I answered, because everyone has a light, Dien. I held his gaze steady and plain. Even you! Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two. Like a man hearing a word in a language he had forgotten he once knew. His hand came up slowly, almost without his permission, and hovered near my face close enough that I could feel the warmth of his palm against my cheek without it touching. Then he pulled it back. He looked at his own hand for a half-second, as if it had acted without authorization. And when he looked up again, there was something careful in his expression. Something being measured and put away. You are a dangerous woman, he said quietly. Not an accusation. Something closer to a confession. You make me want things that don't belong in my world. The garden held its breath. The last of the sunset was going amber at the edges, and the rosemary between my fingers was sharp and clean. And the space between us had the particular quality of a moment that is about to become something. The kind you recognize only while it's happening, which is both the gift of it and the ache. Then his phone rang. The change was instantaneous. Whatever had been opening in him closed like a shutter, and Kang Dae-hyun the man stepped back and Kang Dae-hyun the boss stepped forward in his place, picking up before the second ring, his voice already ice. I watched his jaw tighten, watched his eyes go to the middle distance where people go when they're receiving information, they're simultaneously processing and weaponizing. They hit the northern warehouse. A pause. His hand found the phone harder. And they took my brother. He hung up and looked at me, and the warmth of 60 seconds ago might have been a different country. The war has started. I have to go. I grabbed his arm. He looked down at my hand on his sleeve, not with anger but with the surprise of someone unaccustomed to being physically stopped, and I held on. Dae-hyun, wait. Listen to me. I pressed my free hand flat against the air beside me, feeling it the way you feel a current in water. The energy in this house just shifted. In the last 30 seconds while you were on that call, something changed. I looked at him directly. This is a trap. They don't want your warehouse. They want you out of these walls. He looked at the house. At the gate. The calculations moving behind his eyes were fast and practiced. I have 50 guards posted. She's safe. The guards are human. I tightened my grip on his arm. What's coming isn't. The look he gave me sat right on the line between belief and instinct. Not quite ready to trust the first but too experienced to dismiss the second entirely. A war of it crossed his face in the space of 2 seconds. Stay inside, he said finally, his voice hard but not cruel. Lock every door. I'll be back. He pulled his arm free gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd yanked it, and walked toward the gate without looking back. I stood in the garden with rosemary still in my hands and watched the darkness at the edges of the property begin, very slowly, to move. I didn't go inside and lock the doors the way he told me. I went inside and ran. Up the stairs, down the east corridor, my hand already in my apron pocket closing around the pouch of red brick dust before I reached Hana's room. I didn't let myself think about what I had felt in the garden. That cold lateral shift in the energy of the place, like a tide changing direction. I had felt things like it before, back home when something that had been circling finally decided to come in close. You didn't think about it. You moved. Hana was sitting up in bed with her teddy bear when I came through the door, already awake, already sensing the way children sense things before they have words for what they're sensing. Money? Her eyes were wide and dark. Why is it cold? We're going to play a game, sweetheart. I crouched at the threshold and began laying the brick dust in a slow, careful line. End to end, corner to corner, no gaps. We're building a fort. The best kind invisible. What is a keep-out? Everything that isn't us. She clutched the bear tighter and watched me work without asking anything else. She was a perceptive child. She understood on some wordless level that this was not entirely a game. I could feel it getting closer the way you feel weather, not with your skin, but with something behind it. This was nothing like the sister-in-law's charm, that small, mean, domestic cruelty. This was older, larger, the kind of darkness that doesn't sneak, it simply arrives because it has never had reason to be afraid of anything it has encountered. The Black Dragon Syndicate had sent a professional. The lights went first. Not a flicker, a dying, like something had reached up and pinched them out, one by one down the corridor until the only light was the pale wash of the city coming through the curtains. In the sudden dark I could see my own breath, a thin white cloud in air that had dropped 20 degrees in 30 seconds. Then from downstairs the sound of glass breaking. No shout after it, no alarm, no gunshot, no voice, just a heavy wet sound that I did not let myself name, and then silence that was thicker than the silence before. The salt circle around the house's perimeter was holding. I could feel it straining, being tested, pressure applied at each cardinal point with the methodical patience of something that had done this before. I pulled my grandmother's silver knife from my apron and stood between the door and Hannah's bed. "Stay in the circle, baby, no matter what." "I will," she whispered. The door to the west wing blew open. Not swung blue, both panels slamming back against the walls with a force that shook the frames. A pressure change like something massive had displaced all the air in the corridor at once. He stood in the doorway, tall, robed in black that seemed to absorb the city light rather than reflect it. His skin was the color and texture of something that had been wet for a very long time. His eyes were white from edge to edge, no iris, no pupil, just white, and his chest was absolutely, completely still. He was not breathing, and he was looking directly at me. He didn't speak. Whatever he was, it had moved past language a long time ago. He raised one finger and pointed it at me. A gesture so simple. It almost looked courteous, and the cold came like a wall. Not air, not temperature. Something that hit with physical weight, solid and absolute, and I was off my feet before I understood what had happened, the back of my head connecting with the wall hard enough to white out my vision for a full second. Hannah screamed. I hit the floor and told my body to get up, which it did because there was no other option available. My lungs felt wrong, compressed, iced over, working at half their usual capacity. I got my feet under me and straightened, the silver knife still somehow in my hand, and reached into my pocket with the other. "You are not welcome here." I threw the blessed cornmeal in a hard, flat arc across the threshold. It hit his robe and hissed a sharp, violent sound like water meeting something far hotter than fire. He recoiled, and the sound he made in response was not a human sound. It came from the wrong part of the throat, from somewhere that throats aren't supposed to reach, and it raised every hair on my body from my neck to my wrists. He stepped forward. His feet left prints on the carpet, black and wet and spreading at the edges like ink dropped in water, each one a perfect record of where he had been. He reached for the brick dust line. The moment his toe touched it, the blue light erupted, a crack of it, sharp and clean as a lightning strike, and he flew backward into the corridor with a snarl that shook the walls. Not defeated, furious. He hit the far wall and steadied himself, those white eyes fixing on me with something that was not intelligence. Exactly, but was something adjacent to it. The focus of a thing that has one purpose and is not finished yet. He couldn't cross. The line was holding, but I could feel what holding it was costing me. It started as pressure in my chest, behind the sternum, the place my grandmother called the knowing place. Now it burned. A sharp, gouging pain that pulsed in time with the shaman's movements as he began to pace the threshold, looking for weakness, applying his will to the boundary like a hand testing a locked door. My nose began to bleed, a slow, warm drip that I felt before I tasted it. "Imani!" Hannah's voice high and terrified. "Stay in the circle, baby. Do not cross that line. You're bleeding. Stay in the circle." My voice came out steadier than I had any right to. I pressed the back of my hand against my nose and thought. I needed more than I had brought with me, more than I had left in my own reserves. I needed something rooted here, something tied to this house in blood and bone and belonging. I looked at Hannah. She was already looking at me, her teddy bear crushed against her chest, her small face terrified and resolute in equal measure. Her father's face, I realized. The same bones, the same refusal to collapse. "Hannah." I held out my hand. "I need you to hold on to me. We have to be brave together." She crossed the space between us in 3 steps and grabbed my hand, her tiny fingers shaking, but her grip absolutely certain. The moment Hana's hand closed around mine, the energy came up like a struck match. Not gradual, not gentle. A jolt that started where our palms met and moved up my arm and into my chest, flooding the places that had been burning with something that felt like cool water and something that felt like fire, and somehow was both at once. I had worked with earth energy my whole life, roots in soil and the slow, patient power of things that grow. But this was different. This was bloodline energy, old and concentrated, the kind that gets passed down through generations of people who have fought for survival and won. The golden dragon's blood ran through this 5-year-old child's hands, and it was stronger than anything I had brought with me in a jar. The shaman felt it the instant I did. The sound he made was pure rage, not the hissing, inhuman sound from before, but something deeper, something that came from whatever passed for his core, the scream of a thing that has just felt its advantage slip. He began to chant, and the language of it was wrong in the way. Truly old dark things are wrong. Syllables that the walls and windows and floor of the room received like blows. The windows shattered inward. The wind that followed was not weather. It moved with intention, circling the room, pulling at our clothes and hair, trying to break our grip on each other. I planted my feet and tightened my hand around Hana's and felt her tighten back with everything she had. Her small jaw set, her eyes shut, her father's stubbornness written in every line of her. My feet began to slide. The force of it was immense, relentless. The shaman pouring everything into breaking the threshold because he could feel that if he didn't break it now, he would not break it at all. Dae-hyun, I whispered into the howling dark. Not a prayer exactly. Something more desperate and more specific than a prayer. Where are you? The shaman flew sideways, not stepped, flew, thrown by an impact that came from the corridor behind him, fast and black and edged with silver. Dae-hyun moved through the hallway like something that had stopped calculating and simply become motion, no gun this time. A sword instead, a traditional Korean blade that should have looked ceremonial and didn't. Not in those hands, not at that speed, and the edge of it carried a faint, cold luminescence that had not come from any forge I knew of. He hadn't left. He had circled the estate, come in through the back and returned. The sword met the shaman in a collision of shadows and steel, and the two of them became a single violent thing in the corridor. Dae-hyun's face stripped of everything except absolute focused hatred. Not the cold hatred of business, but the hot animal hatred of a man fighting for something he has only just admitted he cannot live without. I watched him move and understood something I should have seen sooner. My salt and iron had broken the curse on Hana, but it had broken something else open in him too, cracked the careful ice of him and let something older and truer come through. He wasn't fighting for territory. He wasn't fighting for power or reputation or the city laid out below him like a map of everything he owned. He was the dragon, and he was finally protecting his nest. The white light came without warning, a single total flash that burned through my closed eyelids and left nothing behind it. No sound, no impact, just light and then the absence of it, and in the ringing silence that followed, the smell of ozone and something older than ozone. The particular scent of things that have been unmade rather than destroyed. When my vision came back, the corridor was empty. Where the shaman had been, there was only a low pile of ash on the carpet, gray-black and perfectly still, and the dark, oily residue drying on Dae-hyun's blade where he stood in the doorway. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. 3 long scratches crossed his jaw and neck, already darkening. He was breathing hard, but he was standing. He looked at the ash for one long moment. Then he let the sword drop. It hit the floor and he was already moving, crossing the room in 3 strides, and then his arms were around both of us. Hana tucked against his chest on one side, his other arm pulling me in with a force that had nothing controlled about it, nothing measured, nothing of the man who had pointed a gun at me in the dark. He was shaken. I had not expected that. The shaking. This man who ran the city's shadows, who spoke in rooms that made other men's hands tremble. He was shaking, fine and continuous, the way a structure shakes after the thing testing it is finally passed.
I felt it,
he said, low and rough, his mouth close to my hair. The cold. From outside the gate I felt it move through the house. A pause, the kind that carries weight. I knew I had to come back. I let my strength go. Just released it, leaned into him, let the exhaustion and the blood loss and the cost of the night settle over me all at once because there was finally somewhere to put it. You did it, Dae-hyun. My voice came out smaller than I intended. You protected her. He pulled back enough to look at me, and what was in his face was not the cold assessment from the foyer. Not the fury from the west wing doorway. Not even the careful, almost tenderness from the garden. It was something that had moved past all of those into territory that didn't have a careful name. I protected both of you, he said. He held my gaze for a moment that felt like longer, then looked at the ash on the floor and something hardened in his expression, not cold but resolved, final. The Black Dragon Syndicate thinks they can turn the spirits against me. A low, quiet certainty in his voice. They don't know what I have on my side. He reached for Hana, lifting her with both hands and pressed his lips to her forehead for a long, still moment. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on, and he closed his eyes briefly. A man receiving something he had not known how to ask for. Then he looked at me over her shoulder. Amani. He said my name, the way people say things. They have decided. From this moment you are not a guest in this house, you are not an employee. His eyes didn't waver. You are my family, and anyone who raises a hand toward you. His voice dropped to something quiet and absolute, dies. In the corridor the ash settled, and somewhere below us Seoul kept moving, indifferent and bright, unknowing of the war that had just ended in a children's bedroom on its quietest street. By morning the city was talking. The Black Dragon Syndicate's leader had been found in his bed, his body reduced to ash so fine and complete that the investigators who arrived at the scene spent an hour looking for evidence of accelerant before quietly closing their notebooks and deciding collectively that some questions were better left unasked. The official report used language that meant nothing. The unofficial language, the kind that moved through Seoul's underworld in whispers before breakfast, was much simpler. Kang Dae-hyun was untouchable. The golden dragon had come back to himself, and whatever power moved with him now was something none of them had a name for. And men who deal in violence have a very old and very sensible instinct about things they cannot name. They stepped back. They reassessed. They found other interests in other cities. Inside the estate, I felt the shift immediately. The guards who had watched me with barely concealed suspicion for weeks. The ones who muttered when I passed, who moved their coffee cups away from my jars as if proximity might do something to them. Those sane men now dipped their heads when I walked through a room. Not performance, not the mechanical deference they showed their employer. Something quieter than that, and more genuine. The acknowledgement of people who have decided that whatever they don't understand about you, they have seen enough to respect it. Dae-hyun's sister-in-law disappeared from the city with the efficient thoroughness of someone who understands they are not being given a choice. Where she went, I didn't ask. I didn't need to. The important thing was the absence of her, the way the house's energy cleared in the days that followed, like a window opened after a long winter, and Dae-hyun came out of his library. It happened gradually, then completely. First he appeared in the garden in the late afternoons, standing at the perimeter, the way he used to stand in doorways watching. Then he came closer, asking questions, not challenging ones, genuine ones. What does rosemary do that mint doesn't? Why iron and not copper? What does the soil from my grandmother's garden carry that ordinary soil doesn't? He listened to the answers with the focused attention of a man learning a new language, filing everything away with the same precision he applied to business intelligence. Hana thought it was wonderful. She appointed herself his teacher on the days once I was busy, which mostly meant she handed him leaves and told him to smell them and reported his reactions to me in great detail at dinner. One night we sat together on the balcony. The lights of Seoul spread below us in every direction. The city vast and indifferent and beautiful in the way that cities are beautiful when you're finally still enough to look at them properly. My people have a belief, he said. His voice had shed something in recent weeks, not its depth but its armor. When you save a life, you become responsible for it. The saving creates a bond that cannot be undone. I looked at the stars appearing at the edges of the sky. Is that why you won't let me go back to Louisiana? A pause. Then his hand found mine, his fingers lacing through slowly, deliberately, like a man who has thought about doing something for a long time and has finally decided the thinking is finished. I won't let you go, he said quietly. Because you are the only person in my world who sees the man and not the monster. His thumb moved once across my knuckles. You are my magic, Amani, the only kind I've ever believed in. Below us, Seoul glittered on, and I did not say anything for a while. Some things don't need an answer. They just need to be heard, and held, and kept. My heart did something I hadn't given it permission to do. I had arrived at this estate with a suitcase full of jars and a dead woman's instructions, prepared for darkness, prepared for resistance, prepared for the particular loneliness of doing necessary work in a place where no one would understand what you were doing, or why. I had not prepared for this, for the way the broken things in him had knit themselves back together quietly, incrementally, in the space between 1 month and the next, until the man sitting beside me on this balcony was someone I recognized. Not from my grandmother's vision, but from something older and less explicable than visions. I had come here to heal a little girl. Somewhere along the way I had healed a king. Dae-hyun! I turned to look at him, needing him to hear this clearly. My world and your world are still very different. Whatever this is between us, it doesn't change that. There will be more enemies. There will be more darkness. That's not me being afraid. That's just the truth of what we're standing in. He looked at me for a long moment. The city lights caught in his eyes, Seoul's entire glittering weight reflected there like he carried it, which, in every way that mattered, he did. Then he pulled me closer, unhurried, the way he did everything now that he had stopped performing certainty and started simply living it. Let them come, he said quietly. We have salt, we have iron, we have the blood of the dragon. The corner of his mouth moved. And we have something they will never be able to prepare for because they will never be able to understand it. I searched his face. What's that? He leaned down and his breath was warm at my lips, and the city below us kept its million lights burning, indifferent and gorgeous, the way the world keeps turning through every moment that changes everything. We have us, he said, and then he kissed me. It was nothing like I had expected, and I had tried very hard not to expect anything. There was no coldness in it, no careful control, none of the managed distance he had kept around himself like a second skin for God knows how many years. It was warm and certain and deep, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask permission because it already knows it belongs. And it started somewhere in the center of my chest and moved outward until I couldn't have told you where I ended. And the night began. It was the most powerful thing I had ever felt. And I had felt power. When we pulled back, I understood what my grandmother had known from her deathbed. What she had seen in whatever vision had sent me 14,000 miles across the world with a suitcase full of salt and soil and love. She hadn't sent me to heal Hana. Hana was the door. She had sent me here to find the place where I belonged. Not a house, not a country, but a person. This specific, impossible, infuriating, luminous person who had started out pointing a gun at my chest and ended up holding my hand like it was the only steady thing in his world. The Mafia boss hadn't believed in magic. Now he was the one making me believe in forever. Months passed and the estate exhaled. It happened the way healing always happens. Not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of small ones, each ordinary day layering over the last until the darkness that had lived in the walls became something theoretical, something that had once been true but wasn't anymore. Hana's laughter was the clearest evidence of it. She laughed at everything now, at the cartoons on my tablet and the faces Dae-hyun made when I made him smell unfamiliar herbs, and the way the garden frogs came out after rain. Her laughter moved through the estate's corridors and changed the acoustics of the place, filled spaces that had been held rigid by fear and grief for too long. I let myself rest in it, carefully the way you rest in something you know is fragile, because I knew what magic leaves behind. My grandmother had taught me that before anything else, before the herbs, before the chants, before the jars and the circles and the knife, she had sat me down at her kitchen table when I was 7 years old and she had said, every working leaves a footprint, child. The darker the work, the deeper the print. And prints draw things. The shaman's ash was still in the land beneath the carpet we had replaced. I had cleansed it 3 times and I would cleanse it 3 more and still I knew it was there. The way, a scar is there even when you can't see it. A resonance. A frequency that certain things could follow like a trail. I was tending the white lilies along the garden wall one afternoon, Hana's voice carrying from somewhere inside the house when I saw it. A crow. Perched on the iron gate, perfectly still, watching me with eyes that were the wrong color. Not black, not the ordinary dark of a crow's eye, but red. A deep, deliberate red, like something burning very far down. I straightened slowly and took 3 steps toward it. It didn't move. It tilted its head, the way birds do, but there was nothing bird-like in the quality of its attention. It was being used to look at me, and we both knew it. Dae-hyun! He appeared on the balcony within seconds, which told me his instincts had been running quietly under the peace of these months, the same way mine had. What is it? I pointed at the crow without taking my eyes off it. A messenger. The black dragons weren't the only ones who wanted you removed. The shaman had a master, and the master knows the shaman didn't come home. I heard him on the stairs, then on the garden path, and then he was beside me, solid and warm and smelling of the cedar soap he'd started using since Hana decided she liked it. The crow opened its beak and let out a single harsh sound that wasn't quite a caw, too deliberate, too shaped, and then it lifted from the gate and flew straight and purposeful toward the mountains that rose dark and distant at the edge of the city. Dae-hyun watched it go. His hand had moved without thought to the hilt of the sword at his hip. The one he carried everywhere now, the one that had drunk the shaman's darkness and remembered it. "Let them come," he said, low and even and absolutely certain. I looked at him at the steadiness in his shoulders, the clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there the night I arrived. The particular quality of a man who has found what he's willing to die for and has made his peace with that. "I know you're not the same man," I said. "But this time we don't just hold the line, Dae-hyun." I turned back toward the mountains where the crow had disappeared into the gray. This time we finish it. We spent the week preparing, and preparation looked different now than it had when I'd arrived. No more hiding jars in the folds of a suitcase. No more working in the dark while the house slept, hoping not to be found. Dae-hyun cleared the library table himself, rolled up the city maps and replaced them with the ones we needed, and stood across from me while I taught him things my grandmother had spent a lifetime learning, and I had spent a lifetime inheriting. He was the best student I had ever had, which surprised me and probably shouldn't have. The same mind that had built an empire from the city's shadows, precise, patient, capable of holding 10 variables at once without losing the thread of any of them, applied itself to the work with the same focused intensity. It applied to everything. I showed him how to ward his blades with salt water and silver, the specific ratio, the direction of application, the words that were less incantation and more intention made audible. He did it once wrong, asked one question, and did not do it wrong again. I showed him how shadow trails work, the way dark spirits leave traces in the air that aren't visible so much as felt, a drop in peripheral warmth, a slight wrongness in how light sits in a space. By the third day he was finding them without being prompted, pausing in doorways, his head tilting slightly, and naming what he sensed before I confirmed it. It was on the fourth day that we found the thread that led us to the master. It took both of us, Dae-hyun's network moving through the city's political layers while I followed the shadow trail from the gate backward, through whatever channels a crow with red eyes uses to carry messages. They converged on the same name. A government official senior enough to be above most scrutiny, ambitious enough to have decided that ordinary ambition had a ceiling he was unwilling to accept. He had been using dark craft for years to remove obstacles and elevate himself, and what he needed now, what he had sent the shaman for, what he had aimed at Dae-hyun's household like a weapon, was territory. A specific mountain at the city's edge, currently within Dae-hyun's reach, where the land's energy converged in a way that would anchor a dark temple and feed it indefinitely. "He thinks he can buy the gods," I said, looking at the map spread across the library table, the mountain marked in red at its edge. Dae-hyun stood across from me, his expression stripped of everything except a cold, clear grimness. "Then we give him a price he can't pay." He looked up. "We take the fight to his mountain." "Yes." I traced the circle I would need to build there, its dimensions, its cardinal points. "But I'll need to prepare a great circle on the summit. It will take everything I have, Dae-hyun. Every reserve, every last thing I brought from home, and everything I've built since." I looked at him steadily. "I won't be able to defend myself while I work." He came around the table and took my shoulders in both hands, and his eyes, when they found mine, were without ambiguity. "I will be your shield," he said. "Nothing reaches you while you work. Nothing." A pause, quiet and absolute. "I promise you." I felt the tear before I could stop it. A single one, catching the library light before I blinked it away. This man who had looked at me on the first night like I was furniture he hadn't ordered, who had pointed a gun at me in the dark and told me I was insane, who was now standing in his library in the small hours of the morning, his warded blade at his hip and his hands steady on my shoulders, willing to walk into a mountain stronghold and plant himself between me and whatever came. Some things don't translate into language cleanly. I didn't try. I just nodded and we went back to the maps. The mountain felt old in a way that had nothing to do with geology. We began climbing before midnight, following the shadow trail I had mapped from the library. And within the first 100 meters the air changed. thickened, pressed in, took on the quality of something that had been breathed and rebreathed by too many desperate things for too many years. It sat in the lungs differently up here, heavier. Like the mountain itself was exhaling something it had been holding for a very long time. I could hear them before long, not with my ears, with the knowing place, that deep interior receiver my grandmother had spent years helping me tune. 1,000 voices, or the residue of 1,000 voices layered so densely they had become a texture rather than a sound. But trapped things, people and spirits and intentions that had been fed into this place over years of dark working and had never been released. Dae-hyun moved ahead of me with his sword already drawn, his eyes moving through the mist with the systematic patience of a man who had learned in 1 week of genuine study to trust what he sensed as much as what he saw. He didn't speak, neither did I. The mountain discouraged speech. It absorbed it, turned it into something that fed the ambient darkness, and we had both understood without discussing it that we would save our voices for what mattered. The summit opened before us like a held breath releasing. A stone circle, older than anything that should have been on this mountain, stood in the moonlight with the particular stillness of a place that has been used and used and used until the using has become its nature. And at its center, robed in something I made myself not look at too directly, stood the official. He was smaller than I'd expected. They usually are. He laughed when he saw us, a full, delighted sound, the laugh of a man who has decided that the arrival of his enemies is simply the next scene in a story he's already finished writing. The Mafia king and his Bayou witch. He spread his arms wide, the robes moving in a wind that wasn't touching anything else on the summit. You think your little charms can stop the great dark? You think salt and good intentions climb mountains? He raised both hands and the ground answered him. The tremor started beneath my feet and moved upward through my bones, the mountain's energy being yanked sideways, weaponized, turned against its own nature. The stone circle blazed with a sickly light. I dropped to my knees and drove my palm into the dirt. No time for ceremony, no time for anything except the work. I drew the great circle with my fingers and sealed each cardinal point, the only way that mattered at this altitude, with this much darkness pressing in with blood, my own dragged from my palm across the cold earth. Each point locked with everything I had carried from Louisiana and everything I had built since. Now, he was already moving. The sword caught the moonlight as he charged and threw it back tenfold. A bolt of silver in the darkness, and the shadows that surged to meet him broke against the salt, warding on his skin like water breaking against stone. He hit the edge of the stone circle like a force of nature, which is what he had always been, underneath everything. Not a monster, not a boss, but something elemental and ungovernable that had simply needed a direction worth moving in. I stopped watching and went down into the chant, all the way down, past the place where I was cold and afraid and bleeding, past the place where I could hear the battle above me and wanted to look down to the place my grandmother had shown me, the bedrock level where the earth's own energy runs slow and vast and older than anything human beings have done to each other on its surface. I felt it recognize me, and I poured everything I had into asking it to rise. The battle had 2 fronts and I could only hold one. Above me, Dae-hyun moved through the officials' guards with the sword and the warding and the particular ferocity of a man who has decided that losing is not a category that applies to him tonight. I heard it, the sounds of impact, of dark-worked bodies that didn't respond to pain the way living things do, that had to be stopped rather than persuaded. He was stopping them. I held on to that and went deeper. The darkness I was fighting had no body. That was the difficulty of it. It wasn't a shaman with a robe and white eyes that you could throw cornmeal at and watch hiss. It was the accumulated weight of years of corrupt working, fed by desperation and ambition, and the specific cruelty of a man who had decided that power justified its own methods. It pressed against the great circle from every direction at once, looking for the weakness that blood and intention and borrowed earth energy couldn't quite cover. Probing with the patience of something that had learned to wait, my mind bent under it. There is no other word for what it felt like. A bending, a pressure at the center of the thing that makes you you. Pushing toward a breaking point I could feel approaching like the edge of a cliff in the dark, and then the hand settled on my shoulder. Not a physical hand, but not nothing either. The weight of it was specific, familiar, worn into my memory from 30 years of being steadied by it at kitchen tables and garden gates and the sides of sickbeds. I knew that hand before I knew anything else. "Push, child!" Her voice low and unhurried and absolutely certain. The dragon is strong, but the earth is stronger. It always has been. I opened my mouth and the scream came from somewhere below conscious thought, below fear, below exhaustion, below the part of me that was still trying to measure what I had left and ration it carefully. It tore out of me and through the mountain air, and the great circle answered it, every sealed point igniting in sequence, and the pillar of white fire that erupted from the center of it was not mine alone. It carried everything the earth had been asked to give, everything my grandmother had ever poured into her garden soil, everything she had pressed into me across a lifetime of teaching. It hit the official at the center of his stone circle, and he shrieked a sound that started as a human sound and ended as something else entirely. His robes catching and burning with a fire that wasn't interested in ordinary fuel. His power folding back on itself the way dark things fold when the working that sustains them is suddenly, completely reversed. Dae-hyun reached the altar in the chaos of it. I felt rather than saw him, the clean silver arc of the warded blade coming down with everything he had, and the dark stone shattered. Not cracked. Shattered from the center outward, each fragment hitting the ground and going dark and staying dark. The sickly light dying piece by piece until the stone circle held nothing but moonlight, and the smell of something very old. Finally releasing its breath, the silence came all at once. The mist lifted. Not gradually, it simply stopped being there, as if it had only ever been sustained by the working, and had no interest in lingering beyond it. The mountain exhaled something clean and cold, and the moonlight that fell across the summit was the plainest, most ordinary moonlight I had ever been grateful for. I let go of everything it had been holding and fell forward into the dirt. My breath came in ragged pulls, each one an effort, my hands pressed flat against the earth that had answered me. I could feel how much it had taken. I could feel the hollow places where things had been that weren't there anymore. Dae-hyun was beside me before I finished falling, his hands catching me, pulling me up and back until I was against his chest, and his arms were around me, and his breath was coming hard and uneven in a way that told me the fight had cost him too, though he would never be the first to say so. He held me for a long moment without speaking. "Is it over?" His voice, when it came, was stripped of everything except the question. No authority, no cold certainty, just a man sitting in the dirt on a mountaintop asking. I looked up at the sky, clean black and full of stars, the kind of sky you only see when everything that was obscuring it is finally gone. "It's over," I said. My voice came out thin but steady. "The debt is paid." Above us, the stars held their positions, indifferent and ancient and entirely unconcerned with what we had just done to preserve them. I closed my eyes and let him hold me up. We came down the mountain before dawn and drove back to Seoul in silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. The city received us the way cities receive of everyone, without ceremony, without acknowledgement. The streets already moving with early morning deliveries and the first commuters and the indifferent machinery of ordinary life. Nobody knew what had happened on that summit. Nobody saw the pillar of white fire or heard the mountain exhale or felt the moment when years of accumulated dark working came apart at its seams. The war had been fought entirely outside the visible world, and its victory would be recorded nowhere except in the absence of what had been there before. That was enough. It had always been enough. The official was reported missing within 48 hours. Within 2 weeks, anonymous information began arriving at the desks of journalists and prosecutors, sourced, devastating in its specificity. The kind of information that Dae-hyun's network had always been exceptional at compiling, and had occasionally, when it suited him, been exceptional at releasing. The official's crimes unraveled slowly and then all at once, the way these things do, and Seoul spent a month talking about corruption and accountability and the mysterious disappearance of a man who had seemingly had everything. Nobody talked about the mountain. The estate was different when we returned. I felt it before I crossed the threshold, the quality of the air, the way the lights sat in the rooms, the absence of that subsonic pressure that had lived in the walls since before I arrived. Clean. Genuinely, completely clean for perhaps the first time in years. Hana met us at the door. She threw herself at us without discrimination, one arm around Dae-hyun's neck and one hand fisted in my sleeve, and the sound she made was not a word exactly but contained everything a word might try to say. We stood in the doorway of the estate, the three of us tangled together, and Dae-hyun made a sound against the top of her head that I don't think he knew he was making, low and rough and utterly unguarded. That night, we ate dinner at the table like a family that had always known how to do this. No phones, no weapons visible, no shadows gathering in the corners of the room to be monitored and managed. Hana told us at length about everything that had happened during our absence, which was considerable for 2 days, and Dae-hyun listened to every word with his full attention, asking follow-up questions, laughing at the right moments, a father learning the rhythms of his daughter's world and finding I could see that he liked it there. After she was asleep, we drifted to the balcony. Old habit now. Our place for the conversations that needed sky around them. I was looking out at the city when I heard him move, and when I turned he was on one knee on the balcony floor, which was the last thing I had expected, and somehow in retrospect the only thing that made sense. He wasn't holding a gun. He wasn't holding a sword. He held a ring, black, a gold, dark and warm, set with a diamond that caught the city light and held it the way still water holds moonlight from the inside, as if it had always been there. He looked up at me, and his face was the most undefended I had ever seen it. More undefended than fury, more undefended than grief, more undefended even than the shaking in the hallway after the shaman. This was something underneath all of those, the face of a man who has decided to want something openly, without armor, and is standing in that exposure because he has decided the wanting is worth it. Imani. My name in his voice carrying everything he had never known how to say until recently and was still learning. You saved my daughter! You saved my city! A pause. You saved my soul, which I had mostly stopped believing I had. His jaw tightened briefly, emotion pressing against the words. I don't know how to live without your magic anymore. I'm not sure I want to learn. The city glittered below us, patient and vast. Will you be my queen? He asked. Not just for now, for every life we have left. The tears came before I decided to let them, spilling over quietly, and I didn't try to stop them because some moments are large enough to deserve exactly what they bring out of you. Yes, Dian. My voice was steady despite everything. 1,000 times, yes. He slid the ring onto my finger and rose, and when he pulled me close, the city lights blurred warm and bright around us, and somewhere inside the house, Hana slept peacefully in a room with clean corners and no shadows at all. The wedding took 3 months to plan and approximately 5 minutes to feel inevitable. We held it in the estate's garden, which I had spent those 3 months coaxing into something that reflected both of us. Korean white chrysanthemums and Louisiana magnolias growing in the same beds, which the gardeners had initially told Dae-hyun was botanically inadvisable, and which had proceeded to thrive with an enthusiasm that I chose to take personally. String lights ran through the branches of every tree. Long tables held both traditional Korean ceremonial tea sets and cast iron pots of gumbo that Dae-hyun's kitchen staff had learned to make under video instruction from my cousin back in Baton Rouge. A collaboration that had produced, after some memorable failures, something genuinely extraordinary. The silk of my dress was Korean, deep, ivory shot through with gold thread. Hannah's selection, made by a designer who had spent 2 weeks incorporating the small protective symbols I had asked for into the embroidery, so subtly that only someone who knew what to look for would find them. The jazz quartet from New Orleans set up beside the traditional musicians, and what they worked out between them over the course of the afternoon was something that didn't have a name yet, but that everyone agreed they wanted more of. People came from everywhere. Dae-hyun's world and mine, which overlapped in no obvious way and turned out to share more than either side expected. Once the food was on the table and the music was playing and the children were running between the legs of people who would never otherwise have been in the same garden, I saw my grandmother in the back row. She was not visible to anyone else. I was certain of that, and equally certain of what I was seeing. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her good church posture and the particular expression she wore when something was going exactly the way she had always known it would. Not surprised, not even especially moved. Just satisfied, in the deep settled way of someone who planted a seed a long time ago and has come to see it flower. She caught my eye and nodded once. I looked away before the tears could come and found Dae-hyun's face instead, which helped. He was watching me walk toward him with an expression that had no precedent in the man I had met in this same garden months ago. Open, luminous, undisguised, the full force of what he felt given entirely to his face without calculation or management. Hana stood beside him in her flower girl dress, practically vibrating with importance. He took my hands when I reached him and his grip was warm and steady and certain. When the officiant invited him to speak, he turned to the assembled crowd. The Mafia lieutenants and the Bayou cousins and the Seoul socialites and the former kitchen staff and all the improbable rest of them, and he said it plainly. The way he said everything now that he had stopped performing coldness. I used to believe only in what I could see. His voice carried easily in the garden quiet. What I could measure, verify, and control. I thought that was intelligence. A brief pause. This woman showed me that the most powerful things in the world are the ones you feel. And that love, he looked back at me, and his eyes were very bright, is the only magic that has ever mattered. We exchanged rings. The garden was silent in the way that gardens go, silent when something true is happening in them. When he kissed me, I felt the warmth come not metaphorically, but as a genuine physical sensation, spreading outward from where we stood in a slow, golden wave, the way sunlight spreads across water. I heard Hana make a sound of emphatic approval. I heard the jazz quartet begin and the traditional musicians find them, and the two sounds twined together into something new. I felt my grandmother's presence lift, gently, like a hand releasing something. It has carried a long way and is now glad to set down in the right place. The golden dragon and the salt of the earth, finally, irrevocably, one. Life after the wedding settled into something I had no previous template for, so I stopped looking for one and let it be what it was. Dae-hyun moved through the transition the way he moved through everything that mattered to him completely, without half measures, with the focused intensity of a man who has decided and does not revisit decisions. The Phantom Clan didn't dissolve, it transformed, which was harder and more interesting than dissolution. Security infrastructure, technology consulting, protective services for people and institutions that needed them. He took the same mind that had mapped the city's shadows and turned it toward mapping its vulnerabilities, its gaps, the places where legitimate power could do what it had previously left undone. It took years, and it was not always clean, and he came home some evenings with the particular tension in his jaw that told me the old world had pushed back. But he always came home, and the jaw always unclenched by morning. I opened the healing center in the spring of the year after the wedding, in a building near the river with good light and a small garden that I planted myself on my hands and knees over 2 weekends while Dae-hyun pretended not to hover anxiously in the doorway. I taught what my grandmother had taught me: earth energy, plant medicine, the older ways of reading what a body or a space is carrying and addressing it at the root rather than the surface. I expected skepticism and received it. And then I received results. And then I received more students than I had chairs. Seoul was a city of people moving very fast in a very modern world, and an extraordinary number of them were quietly desperate to remember that the earth existed beneath the concrete, and that it still worked the way it always had. Hana grew up in the space between all of it, the healing center and the boardrooms and the garden and the training yard where Dae-hyun taught her to move with a blade, which she approached with the same focused intensity as her father and the same stubborn creativity as no one but herself. He pulled me closer, careful of the baby, his arm warm across my back, and I was so certain I understood everything worth understanding. He shook his head at his former self with the gentle contempt of a man well past that version of himself. The furniture I had accidentally ordered, I remember. He looked at our son, then across the garden to where Hana was running her morning forms, her movements clean and economical, and entirely her own, the sword catching the early light on each arc. He watched her for a long moment with the particular expression he reserved for his children, unguarded, enormous, slightly undone by its own depth. "You were the miracle I didn't know how to ask for," he said quietly. "You healed more than Hana, you know that." I leaned my head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong and completely present. The heartbeat of a man who had come back to himself and intended to stay. The sun was clearing the mountains now, the light going from gold to something cleaner and more certain, spreading across the garden and the city beyond it, and the mountains beyond that where we had once stood in the dark and asked the earth to rise. It had risen, the Bayou girl and the Korean dragon. Our son reaching for butterflies in a garden that had once been full of shadows. Hana's sword catching the morning. The ring on my finger holding its light from the inside, the way it always had, the way I had come to understand it always would. It was a story no one would believe if you told it straight. I had stopped worrying about that a long time ago. It was ours. It was true. And it was not finished. It was not even close to finished. Every ending, my grandmother had always said, is just the earth taking a breath before it begins again. I held my son in the morning light and felt the truth of that in my bones, in the knowing place, in every jar of salt and iron and soil that had carried me across an ocean to exactly where I was supposed to be. The beginning was still beginning. It always would be. By the time she was a teenager, she could identify 40 medicinal plants by touch and disarm. A man twice her size and had strong opinions about both, which she shared freely. She was the bridge between every world we contained, and she moved across all of them without effort, as if she had always known that belonging to more than one thing was not a contradiction, but a gift. We were not a family anyone would have predicted. We defied enough rules and expectations that people eventually stopped applying the usual ones and simply watched to see what we would do next. But occasionally, at the edge of the garden or against the skyline at dusk, I would see a crow with red eyes watching from a distance. I would look at it for a moment, feel for what it carried, and find only distance, only observation, the darkness checking in on something it had lost and not forgotten. Then I would look at the ring on my finger, the black gold, the diamond that held light from the inside. And I would look at whatever doorway Dae-hyun was currently occupying, because he still stood in doorways. Only now it was because he wanted to see what was happening in the room, not because he was deciding whether to enter. The crow would eventually leave. It always did. We had walked into the darkest thing the shadows could send against us, and we had walked back out, and the knowing place in my chest that my grandmother had spent a lifetime teaching me to trust, told me, each time, the same thing it had always told me. As long as we stood together, the shadows would not return. I believed it. Not because I was naive about darkness. I had held it in my hands, bargained with it, burned it off a mountaintop in the middle of the night. I believed it because I knew what we were made of. And what we were made of did not break. Years have a way of becoming each other, and then one morning you look up and find yourself somewhere you couldn't have imagined from the beginning of the road. I was sitting in the garden in the early light, the kind of light that comes before the city wakes up, soft and unhurried and gold at the edges. My son was in my arms, 17 days old, still at the age where the world outside the womb is a continuous source of astonishment. He had found a butterfly. It had landed on the verbena at the garden's edge, and he was reaching for it with the absolute focused intention of someone who does not yet know that wanting and having are sometimes different things. His eyes tracking it were his father's eyes, exactly, dark and precise and missing nothing. With the quality behind them, the openness, the wonder, the sense of something ancient and patient looking out through a brand new face that was my grandmother's. I had recognized it the moment he was born, before I had words for anything, and I had felt her presence move through the room like a warm current, and then settle, satisfied, into stillness. I heard the door, and then Dae-hyun was beside me, lowering himself onto the garden bench with the unhurried ease of a man who has learned over years of deliberate practice to be present in quiet moments rather than merely passing through them. His hand settled on my shoulder, warm and certain. "What are you thinking about, my queen?" He kissed my temple, the words still carrying the slight formality he had never quite shed, which I had long since understood was not distance but devotion. His particular way of saying "you matter" in a language that had always expressed importance through structure. I watched our son's reaching hand fall short of the butterfly, which lifted and resettled 2 inches away, apparently unbothered. "I'm thinking about the day I walked through those doors," I said. With my suitcase and my jars and my grandmother's instructions and absolutely no idea what I was walking into. I paused. I was so frightened. I just didn't let myself feel it until much later. He laughed, the real one, the full one that had taken months to emerge and had been worth every one of them.